Hello, my name's Kim Dowling from Federation University, Australia, and I have the privilege of representing our steering committee for 151 golden years of celebrating education in the geosciences. And I get also to be MC for tonight's talk. Before moving on to our speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting tonight. In my case, that's the Wadawurrung people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Okay, today is the third in our series of talks to commemorate 151 years of geoscience education. And we've had some great informed speakers to date in the fields of geology and history, and tonight it's archaeology's turn. We recognise the significance and prosperity that education has brought to our region, and we want to celebrate that vibrancy and what a community can bring to education and what education can bring to a community. So thank you for celebrating with us. I'd now like to invite our head of campus, Sam Henson, to give us context about the talk and what we're going to hear. Sam, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kim. I would like to also acknowledge the Wadawurrung people, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters around me, and recognise their continuing care for country, including Mount Buninyong and its environs. But can I also acknowledge the Gurnai-Kurnai, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands where our eastern campuses are located and from where Susan Lawrence is speaking this evening. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are with us this evening. Now, a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us for this third event in Federation University's 151 Golden Years celebration. Since the establishment of the School of Mines, Ballarat, SMB, in 1870, Federation University has been educating Australia's future leaders, innovators and thinkers for over a century and a half. Chemistry, metallurgy, assaying and geology were among the first courses offered at SMB, with the Institute quickly establishing a record for innovation and excellence in teaching and experimentation. Blending this educational environment with the practical nature of classes, our graduates were soon globally recognised as well-trained, knowledgeable and job-ready. Today, Federation University's School of Engineering, Information Technology and Physical Sciences is proud of the direct link with our 151-year tradition, and these principles of excellence in education and innovation remain as core values. This series of talks celebrates and commemorates both our heritage and our future, and we're delighted that this third talk can be presented by renowned archaeologist, Professor Susan Lawrence. Before we move on to the talk, can I also acknowledge all the past students, staff and industry partners who have worked with passion to help us attain 151 years of continuous geoscience education. And now it's time for Associate Professor Kim Dowling to introduce our speaker. Thanks, Kim.
Thanks, Sam. Great context. And it is my genuine pleasure to introduce Professor Susan Lawrence. Many of you are probably familiar with her very successful book, Sludge, Disaster on Victoria's Goldfields, which was published in 2019. Susan teaches and leads research at Trobe University, and she's interested in the physical evidence of past human activity, notably the archaeology of colonisation, urban development and mining. One of the things I most admire about Susan's work is the emphasis she gives to collaborative relationships and her interdisciplinary approach. She works with environmental scientists, geologists, ecologists, visual artists, heritage professionals, historians, Aboriginal studies scholars and traditional owners. And I think this brings something very special and significant to her work. She even has a special connection to Ballarat. This was the first place she lived when she moved to Australia. She is active in several national and international heritage and archaeological organisations and is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities. Susan, I really am looking forward to this talk, and I might hand over to you now.
Thank you, Kim, for those kind words. Probably want my video back on too. There we go. So yes, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of this auspicious evening. And thank you, Sam and Stephanie, for helping to organize. I do actually have a bit of a connection to Ballarat and to the School of Mines, or to at least Federation University. Back in the day when I lived in Ballarat and was a PhD student, I used to go out to the Mount Clear campus and use the computer lab, because back in those days, computers were not as common and I did not have one at my house. So I have a bit of connection. Right, I also want to acknowledge country. I am on the country of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. I work on the country of many Victorian traditional owners, and I pay my respects to all their elders, past and present, and to all the First Nations people viewing the presentation. So I don't know if you can see those terribly well, but hopefully these are familiar to some of you. These are some of the regulations around mine rehabilitation and life of mine planning that exist these days. Some of them have even been translated into a range of foreign languages by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade as part of Australia's mining expertise that exported to the world. If you work in mining industry, you probably take them for granted. You might even think they're a bit of a pest. But have you ever stopped to think about where they come from? They actually can be traced to this man, to John Bowser. He was a local newspaper man from Wangaratta. He was the canny political voice for a diverse collection of communities and interest groups from across Victoria, and together they changed the Australian mining industry. John Bowser was born in London in 1856, and his family migrated to Victoria as a child. By the 1880s, he was living in Wangaratta. He ran the Wangaratta Chronicle, and he also owned a little farm east of town along the Ovens River at Millawa. Because of this local experience, John Bowser knew that there was a big problem with Victoria's rivers. The rivers were full of mining debris. All over Victoria at this time, people were complaining about the state of the rivers. On the Loddon River west of Bendigo, the new Lancourie Weir had already accumulated 3 meters of silt only a decade after opening. On the other side of Bendigo at Huntley, the council was organizing a special dredge to empty out the accumulated sand and gravel so that Bendigo Creek could flow again. At Shelford, south of Ballarat, the Lee River was dumping tons of sand on the river flats, and wind was blowing it up the hillsides in layers 1/2 meter thick. The Murray River was said to be as thick as pea soup from Albury-Wodonga all the way to Echuca. The debris blocked the rivers with plugs of gravel. This is an example from later, from the 1950s and from Gippsland, but it gives us a really nice visual of what this material looks like in rivers. The debris blocked the rivers with plugs of gravel like this one. It caused them to change course in some instances, and it triggered massive erosion that cut river channels deep into the surrounding countryside. This is an aerial image of the Lee River south of Ballarat, and you can see this is the current course of the Lee, and this line over here is the course of the Lee in the 1850s until the mouth of that bend was blocked by all the mining debris coming downstream, and it cut this new channel. This is a tributary of the Ovens River east of Wangaratta near John Bowser's farm. And you can see how it's eroded and been cut down several meters below the level of the surrounding paddocks. So these are some of the effects of that sludge in the rivers. The Yarrowee was one of the worst affected rivers in Victoria. We've calculated that about 38 million cubic meters of mine tailings were dumped in the Yarrowee between 1859 and 1891. The river that John Bowser knew best, the Ovens, was even more badly affected. By 1891, we've calculated about 90 million cubic meters of mine waste had been dumped into the Ovens. And that debris covered the floodplains around Bowser's farm with around 6 to 10 feet of sand and silt. Now, this was all debris that came from mining. It came from voids like these, one near Creswick and this other one is up near Beechworth. That's alluvial mining, and these two instances are from ground sluicing and hydraulic sluicing, which was a way of using water to wash the waste material and some of the ore out of the mining areas. But it also came from hard rock mining, from buried alluvial and quartz mines. And this is, of course, one of the heaps out at Smeaton in the very deep Leeds areas. The pile that you can see up behind is the mullock, which was stacked on site. And in the front is some of the tailings that were brought up and crushed when brought to the surface. And in many mines for many years, flushed directly out in tail races into the nearest waterway. So what's really important too, when John Bowser was around in the 1880s and 1890s, this kind of damage to the creeks and rivers in Victoria was not a new problem. By the time he got involved, it had been going on for nearly 50 years, since the very first gold miners had washed their pans beside Yarrowee Creek. And of course, this is Golden Point in 1851 and a detail from Thomas Ham's image. But you can see all of the things that the miners are doing there along Yarrowee Creek and how it's already suffering from that mining activity. These are some of the first person witness accounts that people were reporting all the way there's even ones from the 1850s, but through the 1870s, the 1880s, and after the turn of the century, right up until almost the First World War. Witnesses gave vivid description of debris choking the rivers, filling the water holes, in places water holes that used to be over 10 meters deep and hundreds of meters long that were buried by all this debris. Trees and shrubs and grasses along the river flats were all smothered and killed by the debris. Sheep and cattle and horses couldn't drink from the rivers because of all of the sludge that was in them. And if they tried, the sand that the animals swallowed blocked their intestines and they died. And you can see all of these accounts and many, many more similar accounts that we found in the documentary evidence from this period. Downstream businesses and farmers had protested about this from the start. They called it the sludge problem, and they were complaining in the newspapers and having public meetings right from the 1850s. In 1859, the Geelong newspapers wrote about sludge rolling down like a lava tide upon the cities of Ballarat and Sandhurst, threatening to submerge them and preserve them like Pompeii or Herculaneum. Communities downstream from the mines tried all the legal avenues available to them to stop the damage and to try and recover the costs of their ruined businesses. Downstream from Bendigo, a group of affected market gardeners and orchardists sent a petition to Parliament in 1859. And I've got the image there that I found just recently of a vineyard near Epsom, which I was really excited about because one of the people to complain was a man named Jacques Bladier. And his vineyards were very well known across the colony. He produced prize-winning wines from his vineyards. And he and his neighbors described a most ruinous loss of garden crops and damage to water supply and water privileges, diminished land values and loss of businesses. Basically, they were destroyed and their homes were marooned in what they called an ocean of sludge. In 1859, 398 people around Epsom signed the petition requesting over £7,000 in property damage and lost income. They sent the petition to the government in Melbourne, and the reply was sharp and unhesitating. The government, quote, does not consider the claims in question to be legitimate demands. They concluded that it was the inevitable consequence of proximity to the goldfields, and they advised Bladier and his neighbors to build bigger levees. In 1872, a more influential landholder again raised the issue in Parliament. George Russell was one of the colony's first and largest pastoralists, based at Golf Hill near Shelford, south of Ballarat. And George Russell knew all the right people, including two of his relatives who were in Parliament. He succeeded in getting a commission of inquiry into the damages that he had suffered from the mining at Ballarat, but he got no further than Jacques Boidier had a decade earlier. When the district surveyor looked into the matter, he agreed that there was significant damage along the river, all the way south from Ballarat to Shelford. Unfortunately, the surveyor concluded the damage was caused not by one person or company, but by the whole mining community, who have custom on their side. Basically, there was no point in seeking a court injunction because no individual polluter could be held responsible. Things looked like they might get serious in the 1880s. Landowners around Creswick, pastoralists like George Russell, did succeed in getting injunctions against the Australasian and Madam Berry mines. These were two of the richest mines in Australia at that stage. If they closed, it would have thrown 1,300 miners out of work, not to mention the lost royalties. 11 sitting members of Parliament took the matter directly to the Premier, and a sludge bill went to Parliament. It passed, but the intent of the act was not to prevent the sludge. In fact, it was to allow the Creswick mines the clear legal right to dump sludge in the waterways. Over 50 years, there were numerous government commissions and inquiries into sludge. The biggest was in 1886. At that time, the commissioners visited 29 rivers all over the colony and interviewed 163 witnesses. The final report was almost 200 pages long and included 10 very detailed recommendations. The commissioners were sympathetic to mining, but even so, they were so concerned about the scale and extent of the damage they saw all over the colony that they took the trouble to draft a bill to be considered by Parliament. It may or may not surprise you to hear that this report and the bill disappeared virtually without trace. The report was tabled, but I could find no evidence that Parliament took the slightest notice of it. In fact, by this time, the late 1880s, the mining industry had already started to decline. It turned out that the commissioners had seen the industry at its height. By the 1890s, mining was a mere shadow of what it had once been. And these are just some of the commissions and inquiries and so on into the sludge problem in Victoria. The damage was done by that time, though, by the time the commissioners were looking around. We calculated as part of the Rivers of Gold project that Kim alluded to, which is a multidisciplinary project with a number of environmental scientists, that by 1900, about 650 million cubic meters of mine tailings had been dumped in Victorian rivers. And what we've demonstrated or shown in this map, the way we've visualized it, is we've calculated the amount of tailings based on the documentary record kept by the mining surveyors and used various ways of calculating the amount of sludge based on what they were reporting. We then divided that by all the mining districts and superimpose them on the river systems in Victoria. And the pies show you the colors are the different branches of mining that have contributed tailings. And so the colors show that in different parts of the colony, different branches of mining were producing more tailings than others. And the size of the pie, of course, shows the overall amount of tailings in those areas. So we can see that Beechworth is far and away the biggest producer of tailings in the state or in the colony as it was then. And Ballarat is coming a pretty close second. When I show this slide in Bendigo, they get cross because they like to be the first in everything. And so they're always disappointed that Ballarat had more tailings than they do. Anyway, an awful lot of tailings that were there. By the turn of the century, around 1900, the advent of bucket dredging gave the industry a whole new lease on life and also brought the renewal of the sludge problem. So dredging, and this is a photo of one in actually a river in New South Wales, but identical to the ones in Victoria at the same period. Bucket dredging was invented in New Zealand on their massive big snowmelt rivers on the South Island and was brought to Victoria in the late 1890s, around 1900, and really caused a big boost to the industry for the period up until the First World War. The dredges worked directly in the river channels, certainly for the first few years. So right in the river channels themselves, and in places, and certainly the later dredges, were digging down up to 40 meters deep in these river channels and adjacent river plain areas. So an enormous amount of damage being done to those riverine environments. And we calculated, again, using the documentary records, we worked out that dredges were responsible for about another 170 million cubic meters of tailings going into the rivers. And you can see in this graph, we have shown in gray, that's the number of dredges operating at any given time. So you can see it peaks there in that period just before the First World War. And then there's another little burst in the 40s and 50s. And this gold line is actually the tailings that are being discharged. And you can see that, unsurprisingly, they peak when the number of dredges peaks. But what's interesting is how in the later period, there's far fewer dredges, but there's still a lot of tailings. And in fact, that's because the dredges become so efficient. Efficiency in recovering ore means greater amount of sediment that can be processed to get that ore. So they're discharging a lot of tailings. So dredging then is contributing a whole other layer of sludge to the rivers. So it's around this time during the beginning of the dredging industry that John Bowser gets involved. Now, Bowser was not just a newspaperman and a farmer. As you can see there, he was an MLA as well. He was also a past president of the Country Press Association, so he had a large network of connections able to get stories into the press. He was also the local MLA. He was an influential country liberal, as they were called in those days, and he was a voice for the Victorian Farmers Union, a real representative of rural communities. Bowser was an astute and very able politician. He implemented responsible financial management and advocated on a number of important rural issues of the day. He later became premier as a leader of the Liberal Party and was eventually knighted for his contribution to the state. So this competent and resourceful man, this well-connected journalist turned politician, knew that the problems he saw on his local river were much bigger and more widespread than just the ovens. And these are just some of the headlines in the newspapers at the time. And you can see all of the controversies there. A lot of these are from the Loddon, but also from the ovens, and really all over the state. Bowser knew that communities from Avoca to Bairnsdale, from Seymour to Wodonga, were up in arms about the problem of this mining debris. Delegations from all over the state had been trekking to Melbourne to bring their case to government. They visited every politician that they could find, and they brought many politicians with them. Some of the organizations in these delegations were groups like the Kiewa Anti-Dredging League from Northeastern Victoria, the Loddon Anti-Sludge Association from Central Victoria, the Ovens River Frontage Anti-Sludge Pollution Association from the Ovens, and they were joined by groups like the Corowa Progress Association from across the border in New South Wales. They were so concerned about pollution in the Murray. The Bairnsdale Waterworks Trust from Gippsland and the Rutherglen Waterworks Trust as well. These were all community-led organizations that were protesting about sludge. Now, these community protests weren't new. As we have seen, people have been protesting since the 1850s. Oh, what are we doing? There we go. But what was different this time? Well, they had previously always been effective, but this time something had changed. In fact, quite a few things had changed. First of all, the economics of mining had shifted, and that is what this slide is demonstrating. In this slide, we can see the red is the amount of gold being produced, and you can see after the peak there in the 1870s, it's declined quite a lot We didn't have any figures for that later period, which is why it doesn't go into there. But you can see that it's starting to decline. But what's really important is, oh, sorry, that's the alluvium. What am I saying? Here's the gold yield is way down here. But what's also really important is the population involved in mining. So in the 1850s, Jacques Bladier, the winemaker, had no hope of getting anywhere with government because so many people were miners. They were all supported by the mining industry. By the 1890s, that had changed. And mining, even those big dredges, really was not employing that many people. So mining was not the economic powerhouse that it had been. And that meant it had lost a lot of its political influence. People could see that the cost benefit of mining was no longer there. And they were increasingly concerned that the costs were outweighing the benefit. That quote, "too high a price for gold," is actually from Donald Cameron, who was the Minister for Mines at this time. And even he was wondering if the effects of mining were too environmentally damaging. The second thing that had changed by this time was that mining had lost their social license. The first national parks had been established by now, and the tourism potential of places like the Ovens Valley was also being identified. In fact, the local MLA for Beechworth, who was in Parliament most of the time defending the miners and protesting against sludge, would get up in practically the next session and speak passionately on behalf of the tourism industry in the Ovens Valley. He was called out on that. It was quite amusing. But people are starting to recognize the natural beauty of some of these areas. Also by then, the mining hiatus in the 1890s during that depression had allowed the rivers to clear. They had started to rid themselves of the sludge, and a new generation of farmers had grown up who were familiar with the rivers being clear, and those farmers expected the rivers to stay that way. So they were not comfortable with all the sludge that had been in them. Then another factor was that the government had been recently spending a lot of money on irrigation infrastructure on the rivers. By 1903, they had spent £8 million on irrigation infrastructure around Victoria. And that's all about getting water out of the rivers for farming. If mining is dumping tailings into the rivers, that's going to be a problem. Another factor also at this time was the Federation drought. And that really intensified everybody's concerns about the availability of water and water supply. Farmland, especially in the Mallee, was blowing away in the dust storms. Water was being shipped in on trains. People suddenly realized that rivers mattered. And the final factor was John Bowser himself, who was a really effective voice in Parliament and who was very well connected with his rural electorate. So in 1902, John Bowser introduced a private member's bill. That member's bill didn't get past the first reading, but it got attention, a bill to prevent the pollution of rivers and other watercourses with sludge. At this time, the Old Mines Act was due for amendment, and prompted by Bowser, the new bill included a clause to curtail sludge. Now, this new clause was immensely controversial. Members from mining regions were extremely alarmed at the prospect. The member for Gippsland's mountain mines claimed in Parliament that it will be a bad day indeed for all concerned with mining. And there was rousing applause. The clause was debated for weeks before the whole mining amendment bill collapsed with the summer recess. There was agreement, though, that rivers were important. Everyone agreed about that. Even the Premier, Alexander Peacock, a former mine manager himself at Creswick, admitted that reasonable restrictions should be imposed. And he admitted, "We know that some of those who have been engaged in the industry in the past have been regardless at times of the interests of other people." This was quite a significant admission. The problem that everyone had was which rivers should be protected. In fact, it was a classic case of NIMBYism. Everyone agreed that rivers should be protected, but the rivers that the mines in their area were involved with should be excluded from anything that was being done. So basically, the clause got bogged down in the technicalities of resolving how that decision would be made. Bowser, however, did not give up. With a new sitting came a new mines bill and a new sludge clause. John Bowser declared that an obligation is laid upon this House to see that the injury now being done is not continued and is not written permanently on the face of this state. And even the Minister for Mines saw the need to protect the rivers. It was in support of this clause and this bill that Donald MacLeod said it is possible to pay even too high a price for gold, and he threw his full support behind the bill. The mining interests lined up against it, but as before, but Bowser and MacLeod had a strategy. Bowser had learned from the experience of Californian legislators with similar problems, and they had set up something called the California Debris Commission. Inspired by this, Bowser and Cameron put in their new clause, provided for the establishment of something they called a sludge abatement board. And the sludge abatement board would be responsible for deciding how measures to protect the rivers would be enacted and which rivers should be involved. The responsibility for that decision was delegated to the SAB. So the legislation was now unshackled by the technicalities of which rivers to protect, and that allowed the bill to be passed. With the Mines Act of 1904, Victoria finally had legislation that would stop the tailings and protect the rivers. And I should pause here and say, this was the first legislation in Australia, where anything like this had been attempted. I think it's really the first environmental protection legislation in the country. So the Sludge Abatement Board had representatives from a number of different areas, from mining, but also from water supply, remember the irrigation agriculture, and from the lands department. So it was very representative of a range of rural interests. The Sludge Abatement Board immediately began an ambitious program of traveling the state, holding public inquiries, inspecting the most notorious trouble spots, and prosecuting offenders. The Sludge Abatement Board worked with mines to develop effective tailings dams to keep that sludge out of the rivers. They published all kinds of useful information and guidelines and diagrams and instructions. And this is just some of the ones taken from the Sludge Abatement Board's reports. You can see this is one kind of dam that they're proposing, and here's instructions on another one of how to construct the tailings dams. And here's an illustration of one that they really approved of at Eaglehawk near Bendigo, and the tailings dam that company had. So they were really trying to work with the industry and encourage mining to do the right thing. The SAB also started a second initiative, resoiling, particularly in landscapes that had been dredged. Dredging, especially along the Ovens, was widely considered a blight on the landscape. It left hectares and hectares of prime river flats as what the inspectors called shingled waste, basically just large expanses of gravel. And the SAB imposed conditions on dredge leases, first of all, to get the dredges out of the river channel so they weren't directly in the river anymore. They could still be on the banks, but they couldn't be right in the rivers. And they also made operators resoil. That meant that they had to remove the topsoil separately and stack it and then replace it afterward. And that's what this apparatus is. This is, again, the kind of information that the SAB published. They worked with the industry, inspecting what people were doing, reporting on it, experimenting, talking about what worked and what didn't. And published pictures like this where you can see that's the actual resoiling boom there separately to the rest of the discharge that's being sent out. And so they also started to publish kind of before and after photos. Now, these are not exactly the same part of the Ovens Valley, but they certainly give the idea. The one on the left being the kind of diggings that had been left from the 1850s and 1860s. And then on the right, a very similar area after it had been dredged and resoiled, the ground leveled out, and this crop of trees that's been planted there. And so the SAB was so successful in these efforts and working with industry that by the 1930s, when those really big dredges were coming along, the industry was actually promoting dredging as a tool for restoration. Now, the SAB lasted into the 1980s. It influenced soil conservation efforts in the 1950s and helped to lay the groundwork for things like the Environmental Protection Association and Authority. And Victoria's EPA, in turn, was the model used by places like Western Australia. And that anti-sludge legislation influenced mining legislation in Queensland. It was incredibly influential in a lot of places. The SAB was effective because it was able to enforce compliance. Today, tailings dams and remediation and so on are now commonplace, and hence those guidelines that I showed at the beginning. Compliance, not so much, I'm afraid to say. And in fact, a recent report by the Victorian Auditor General's office was very damning of the policies and regulations in Victoria, and really the resourcing that is being provided to enforce effective regulation of rehabilitation liabilities. But back in the early 20th century, John Bowser was justifiably proud of the success of the Sludge Abatement Board. He told Parliament in 1914, that work will be looked back upon by young Victorians of the future as the most valuable work done by any board or commission. Instead, of course, we know that the fight for rivers has been entirely forgotten. We didn't know anything about this until a decade ago, and probably most of you didn't either. So in fact, young Victorians have not looked back in gratitude for Bowser and his work. We've forgotten it. In part, this is due to his success. The rivers were saved. They have become the green and verdant places that we love. But it's also because Victoria has forgotten that it is a mining state. We have forgotten what happens when industry is not monitored effectively and when community vigilance slips. We may have forgotten, but the rivers have not forgotten. The tailings are still there. And these are images from our Rivers of Gold project again, and my colleagues in that, with tailings deposits in several rivers around Victoria, the Loddon, the Yarrowee, and Hodgson's Creek up a tributary of the Ovens. These tailings are still there, contaminated with arsenic and mercury, inhibiting plant growth, and basically still causing problems. As Bowser feared, the damage has actually been permanently written on the face of the state. So the excitement of discovery that we heard about at the beginning of this series of talks from Dennis Arnn is really beguiling. And I grew up in a resource economy in the oil industry. It is an intoxicating thing. That idea of discovery and growth and the real adventure that is part of a resource economy. But when I look back on mining's environmental legacy, it's also deeply troubling to think of a renewed mining industry here in Victoria. So I want to end by amplifying Eric's call to action from the previous talk, where he talked about a vision to educate future generations of mining professionals. And I heartily endorse that, but I also think it's really crucial that such a vision include education about sustainable mining and about the legacies that future mining can create. John Bowser knew that he was an ancestor. He spoke frequently about the importance of protecting the rivers for generations to come. That's us, as it happens, and we are the benefactors of that vision. So I leave all of you with a question. What kind of ancestors do we want to be? Thank you.
Excellent. Goodness gracious. You have given us so much to think about. Where to start? I can see there are little hands of applause going across the screen. Thank you so much for a very thought-provoking talk. Just while people get their I don't know, confidence in asking a question, I'll just look at the chat. There was quite a little bit of commentary regarding water race systems and their actual impact. I think that's from Tom. Water race systems are sometimes blamed for the sludge problem. Aren't sludge waste problems mainly determined by mining practice? How waste is dealt with by miners? Any comments was the question. So I think that do you have a commentary regarding the water race system and how that might have impacted?
Yeah, sure. Well, our research, as some of you probably have heard me talk about before, our research actually started with the water races. As Kim mentioned, I'm actually an archaeologist. I didn't talk very much about archaeology tonight, but my curiosity was piqued by the archaeological evidence of water races in places like the Creswick State Forest and elsewhere, other mines around Australia that I've been to. And so we started to look into the question of what those races were about, what was going on with that water. And that led us to the sludge problem and wondering, where the dirt had gone that those water races had produced. So in some ways, water races caused the problem because mining uses and did use a huge quantity of water. We don't think about that part of mining, but actually water is a big part of the mining story. And so the water races delivered the water to the mines. And then once the mines had used the water, they discharged it in a very polluted condition, which is where the sludge came from. So water races are the upstream end of the sludge being the downstream end of it, and the mines are in the middle. So it wouldn't have made any difference whether the races were piped. And these days, mines don't use water races. They often use groundwater or other sources. So it's not really about where the water is coming from. In this case, it's about the fact that there were no regulations really about what they did with the discharge. And so they're part of the same issue, but yeah, you could still have water being supplied if the discharge was managed more effectively, or you could still have a lot of discharge even though you were getting your water from somewhere other than races. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Great, thank you. It answers my part of the question. We've got another question from Margarita. What was the effect on fish? Do we have any idea of the effect on the fish?
Look, they don't tend to talk about fish very much in those, anything that we have seen. But I would imagine it would have a terrible effect on fish because the rivers literally were full. They were so full of sediment that they couldn't flow. They were, the beds were just increasing and flowing out onto the floodplains. And so the fish would have been killed, I'm sure. The only thing that we ever saw about fish specifically was during all of the debates about introducing the regulations. And that was one of the complaints by the mining industry, that this legislation was because some of those community groups were fishing associations. That's what the Korowa Anglers Club, they were fishers. And the mining industry was complaining that the great industry which built Victoria was going to be stopped, all because people wanted a Sunday afternoon fishing recreation. So that was the only reference we found to fishing.
Interesting. I hope that answers your question, Margarita. I've got a question from Mark Clarkson. It's a longish question. Mark, would you like to put that yourself, or are you happy for me to read it out for you?
I'm happy to give a précis of it. I live in Queensland. Queensland, Western Australia and New South Wales are collectively known as the mining states. And we have fairly robust mining legislation relating to mine operations as well as the safety and health of mine workers. We often laugh at Victoria because of the paucity of your legislation. Most of the large operations, like your brown coal operations, come under state agreements, which is an agreement between the operator and the state government, which completely exempts them from any legislation. All the terms and conditions related to the operations are in the agreement. The smaller operations come under the Mineral Resources Sustainable Development Act 1990, which is a grand sounding piece of legislation. And the provisions relating to safety and health come under Part 5.3 of the Occupational Health and Safety Regulations 2017. The Act doesn't apply. There's only a few provisions in the regulations that apply to mining. And none of this legislation is considered very onerous by mine operators. And the question I was really posing is that if the 1880s were revisited today, if they had another large gold strike at Ballarat or Bendigo and all the miners rushed there from all over the world, you'd probably get the same result, because the modern regulatory framework wouldn't really operate any better than the framework did in the 1880s.
Mark,
fair comment?
Thank you, Mark. You have explained all of that far better than I could, because I am an archaeologist. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's why I say Victoria has forgotten it's a mining state, and we have absolutely allowed all of that stuff to languish. And I think, you mentioned the Victorian Auditor General's report as well. Very, very damning of the way that mining regulation is managed in Victoria. Not necessarily saying the industry is a problem, but we're not regulating it the way we should. And that's why I'm torn by Dennis's talk, which was about the fact that there is a mining boom going on, still at the exploration stage, really. And we do know mining did bring a lot of good things to Victoria, but if we're not careful, we will end up back in the 1880s. So it is really just
and occasionally they grumble about it, but they don't ever appear to do anything about it.
No.
Can I then follow up about how we address that as a problem? Because you mentioned it's important to educate people who work in the industry, but I wonder about how we go about actually reinvigorating Victoria to be, to acknowledge its heritage and to be aware of the cost benefit in this space. I mean, industry and development, all of that's what can be wonderfully positive. I think in your talk you mentioned, that the having the right resources so people can go out, so that the sludge investigators could work out, what's going wrong, and enforce and encourage and help operators make it work. We don't seem to have that today. How do we change the narrative so people are respectful of the environment and the economic benefit that happens in that space? What do we do?
Frankly, you don't have the expertise in Victoria. You just don't have the expertise. Yeah. It's a little like when the coal mine blew up in New Zealand, they got all the Queensland experts to go over and help them sort it out. You don't have the expertise in natural resource governance, and in mining, you don't have the expertise in Victoria. If you're going to do anything about your historic problem, and I suspect the problems that are arising now and going forward, you need a level of expertise and education which you don't have. Very few people study mining engineering. I did at Federation University, in fact. I'm yet to be conferred with my Masters of Mining Engineering. But I've also got a Master in Laws of Natural Resource Governance from University of New England. That sort of expertise you don't have in Victoria. There's no one in the public service or the regulatory departments that have that expertise.
And Kim, I would say that it's governments respond to where they think people are interested. And that's where I say that community vigilance and community awareness is still our best weapon. That is why they were able to get things changed in the in the 1900s, is because all of those community groups suddenly got together across the whole state and found some politicians willing to listen to them. So yeah, I think it's up to all of us to put that pressure on politicians to resource the Earth Resources Department, and to employ the people with the expertise, and to encourage people to go to the School of Mines Ballarat and get the training that they need.
Thomas, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, from you were explaining all the issues and the problems which happened in the past, and and some of them are still apparent today. But what are the major issues today with that uncontrolled deposition of tailings?
That's a very good question. And this is where we get into Kim's expertise. In fact, a project that I would love to do with Kim. But the Rivers of Gold project that I've referred to a couple of times, what we were doing was looking at where the sediment had got to in the rivers. One of my colleagues, Ian Rutherford, is a geomorphologist who really understands river systems and how they operate. So he was looking at the physical effect, if you like, on what has the consequences for those rivers, and the way that they really don't function the way rivers should anymore, because they are, many of them, so in size, so they're not connected with their floodplains, so they're not recharging the local aquifers. And of course, all of the revegetation that people try and do along riverbanks, the seed banks are just not there because they're under all of that sediment. So there's some kind of mechanical things, I guess you would call them. Also the sand slugs that are moving downstream, because in some places they are still moving downstream. Around Newstead, there's a big sand slug. There's another sand slug up south of or downstream from El Dorado. There is some discussion about whether the problems with the Barma Choke in the Murray River might be at least partly attributed to mining sludge. So the sand slugs are there causing problems. So you've got the mechanical problems, then you've got that chemical contamination. And we've certainly identified elevated arsenic levels in those sediments. We weren't really looking for mercury, so I haven't got any real information about that, other than the EPA did some testing a few years ago, not even in what I would consider hotspots, and they also found elevated mercury in some places. I do have a grant application in at the moment with a team of mercury specialists, so we can hopefully learn a bit more about that. And of course, Kim's research looking at the more terrestrial side of it, the wind-blown dust and things, and the arsenic that's in that, and the danger for people. So it's really about, we can't manage it and we can't avoid it if we don't know about it. And one of the things with Victoria forgetting that it's a mining state is we've forgotten that we live surrounded by mining debris. And so we don't take the proper precautions because we don't know that's what it is. So I think that's, part of what I'm trying to do is just make people more aware that it's something they should look into.
Thank you.
Excellent. Bob, I can see you've got your hand up next, so if I can go to you.
Hi, Suzanne, thank you very much for the presentation. It's fantastic. I've read the book Sludge, and tonight has been just fantastic, ties everything together. One of the things I'm wondering is, as member of land care groups and so on, what can we do now to help alleviate these problems that have been generated in the past? What's considered the best treatments for these soils, sludges, and so on? We can't get rid of them. So how do we abate the damage that's been done? So have you got any comments on that for us?
This is where I'm not really an ecologist at all, so not really in a good position. But what I have heard people say is one thing is, to try and revegetate so that it's not a lot of exposed dust that's blowing around. So that would be a big thing. If people are doing projects along waterways, people talk about reinstating the more natural contours and things. I think it's probably worth getting soil testing done to see what kind of arsenic levels there might be there, because my understanding of the arsenic is that if it's in a sort of saturated environment, that's when it starts to become more of a problem. But I think it's really just, if there's an area that's downstream of a mining location, it's, do some research and find out whether there might be sludge there and what you might need to do to be aware of it. In terms of, all of the wonderful work that Landcare does in revegetation things and planting and so on, I suppose it's kind of knowing that, in these areas, you can't just fence it off and hope that, all of those little things, the grasses and the orchids and so on, are going to come back once you get the grazing out, because they're buried beneath a meter of sludge. So you might need to be more proactive in, trying to put some of those understory things back in. So I don't know, those are pretty small things. I didn't show the map of all the rivers in Victoria that have been affected, but it's 75% of our river systems that have some kind of mining impact in them. So I think we have to also kind of accept that there's a certain amount of it we just can't unscramble the egg.
Susan, thank you for that. Can I just ask one follow-up? Has there been any mapping done, and is it available of that sludge contamination areas? I'm from Ballarat, and yeah.
No, that would be a wonderful project. We've done a little bit of investigation. I've got a fantastic PhD student who's been using GIS, Geographic Information Systems, to do some modeling of sludge in Ballarat, but not in the kind of way that you're talking about with that. There's lots of historic maps that will show, tailings piles and things, and sludge dams, but yeah, not in a broad level. Bendigo has, they did some regolith mapping there and have a layer that is probably sludge through the Bendigo Valley, but I'm not aware of anything from Ballarat.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that.
I can see Rex. I think your hand's up next.
Thanks. Very nice talk. It went over very well and we learned a lot. Just a quick couple of questions, if I may. With the sludge, we're talking about treated clays. We're not talking about the mullick, which we see on the mullick heaps now, which were untreated clays, which they gathered when they were digging the shafts. So that's untreated. And now we're talking about the fine sludge which went through the tailing dams and through the process of extracting the gold. So we've got two separate types of clays and that in this, I think. My other question or the observation was, we didn't talk a lot about the pollution levels like mercury and arsenic and cyanide. There was a lot of cyaniding done around Ballarat, and there was a lot of mercury used in all the batteries. In fact, I went prospecting up in the up around El Dorado, round behind where the dredge was, and I got enough gold in mercury, which was sitting on the bottom of the river there, just in my pan, and I got a lot of tin as well, but there was enough mercury, and with that mercury was an amalgam of gold. And I took the gold down to Federation University. I took the jar of amalgam and had it extracted, and I got a piece of gold as big as a teaspoon out of that. So there's still a lot of that there, and there's a lot of mercury too. That's all I've got, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, you're right about both of those things. With the what's actually in the sludge, it depends on where it's coming from and the kind of mining that's being done. So you're right, if it's underground mining, it is the tailings that have been processed, the slimes that have been through the batteries, so really fine-grained clays and silts. But if it's some of the other kinds of alluvial mining, the open cast mining, the sluicing and things, they're processing the mullock, they're using the water to get rid of the mullock. So lots of gravels, big gravels and sand and much bigger material is going down from those. So that's one of the things that we really were finding with the geomorphologist that I worked with. He kept saying, well, it's this, it's that. And I'd say, well, it depends on the kind of mining. It's really variable. And your observation about mercury, other people have told me that about that El Dorado region as well, and just picking mercury out of the creek. And I would really, really like to see that because it just sounds amazing. And I know that there are other parts of Victoria too. Walhalla is another hotspot, and the Upper Goulburn, Woods Point, and that a lot of mercury in those rivers. That's why I say when the EPA did their testing, they were really testing places where there's a lot of fishing that goes on. They weren't necessarily testing the places where we would expect to find a lot of mercury. And that's the new project that I'm hoping to get funded for next year with the mercury experts, is to go to those places where we know, as you say, all the batteries, all the government batteries and so on. I really want to find out, what's the signature around those places where we know that there's mercury. Downstream of Clunes was pumping out an awful lot of mercury. So yes, absolutely.
Good, thanks very much.
I might just move. I know we're fast running out of time, and there's just a couple more. We could perhaps at least fit in one more. I think someone also called Susan. Is there much information of the impact on First Nations people?
Again, I will point to Kim's Federation University colleague, Fred Carr, who has literally written the book about First Nations people during the gold rush and the way that they responded to it, which obviously was extremely upsetting and a big upheaval for them, but they also responded very creatively in some ways too, and really took advantage of some of the opportunities that it offered to them. So yeah, I definitely refer you to Fred's book. Contemporary traditional owners today, I worked especially with people with Judjarung, people around Bendigo, and they describe their country as upside down country because they recognize that mining has turned it over and the topsoil's underneath all of the stuff that's on top now. They're very, very aware of the effect of mining. Their country plan for Judjarung country, for Jandak, for the next 30 years focuses extensively on remediating former mining places and trying to restore them in some way. They're extremely focused on this, definitely.
We are completely out of time, but I do notice there's one other person with their hand up. If you can indulge us just for a little bit, one more moment. Dominic, I can call on you, but please make your question as direct as possible. Oh, I've lost your hand. Yes, there we go. Hi, Dominic.
Thanks very much. I loved your book. I took myself cycling down in Anfield on the weekend when I first out of lockdown and found a forest heavily disturbed with deep sludge in the river valleys and coppiced, spindly forest where they chop the trees down. And one of my reactions to your book was to be actually quite saddened by the story. You've uncovered a complex and interesting, quite disturbing story of Victorian history. I'd be interested in how you reacted emotionally to revealing this history.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's really sad when you see this. And that's why I'm always very difficult, to talk about it and feel like, it's really going to be a downer for everyone. It is such a terrible thing. And I guess, the thing that's why I try and think about, well, what does it mean for us today and our responsibilities? Because we have inherited everything that was done in those years when people weren't thinking about it. They weren't aware. They weren't really thinking about the consequences. And we in Victoria are in this unique situation because we live with consequences of mining that is 100 years old and 150 years old. And, if we don't look at what that has done to our environment, then we're not going to learn those lessons for how we mine today sustainably in other places and in Victoria. So I try and I think, that's one thing about it. The other thing about it is really to think about how incredibly resilient the natural world actually is when humans are not stuffing it up, basically. The reason that we have forgotten about all this is because these mining places are revegetated. And I'm interested to hear you describing Enfield as coppiced and so on, because lots of people, would not recognize that. It takes a really skilled eye to see that. Lots of people think that all of that bushland in central Victoria is natural bush, and nothing could be further from the truth. But it has recovered. It's covered with trees and bushes, and there's butterflies and birds, and we want to protect it as national parks because nature has recovered. And the rivers, we've forgotten all of John Bowser's work because they look like nice rivers. Unless you are a river expert like my friend Ian, they look like they're fine. So I think, that is hope as well, that if we stop doing things that disturb these systems and do our best to sort of do so in the most minimal interventionist way, there's nature is also very powerful. So those are the sort of the good spins on it, I suppose. But yeah, it's really sad to think of what this place must have been like 200 years ago when it was just the traditional owners who were here.
Far from being a sad story, I found your talk a rallying cry for us to be better aware of our history and to look to our future. I think we have to take this as a pivotal moment. We do need to be better informed. Your book is a step in the right direction for us to get that information, but actually to be aware of our environment and to participate both socially and politically and every way we can possibly do to get the best outcome for our environment and for the future. So I'm upbeat about this. In fact, I'm really very positive. I think your talk was wonderful. I've really enjoyed it. I'm getting the wind-up signal just before we finally thank Susan for her brilliant presentation and advocate the purchase of her book. I will say that this series is continuing in coming months because of COVID and everything else. We can't do the cafe event. But we will send notices out to people of upcoming talks to take us to the end of the year, just to continue this conversation, I think. So my last comment tonight is to again thank you so much, Susan, for an inspirational talk. I am feeling very upbeat and positive. If you can join me in putting those little yellow hands together to say thank you to Susan for quite a brilliant presentation. So thank you very much.